I'm here. I'm ready.
You are there.
I've started my recording.
Well done.
I've dumped the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the Secretary of DFAT.
Were they all at your shindig?
Yes. They were. Secretary of DFAT was on my table and I have made my apologies.
You could have texted us and said you've reflected on your choices and realised that perhaps your time was better spent elsewhere, Tenant.
This is true.
Well, I think that would have been what's known in the trade as a dick move.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on World Laundryland. As always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for ESG and T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. I am now a lady of leisure and enjoying, well, not so much enjoying the ever-expanding waistline situation, but I am enjoying wearing tie-dyed T-shirts more often.
Yeah. The leisure may come to something of a halt soon.
A very abrupt end, but I'm enjoying this while it lasts, guys.
Soak it up.
I think our listeners should enjoy your presence with us while it lasts as well, because you are going on a well-earned break after this episode. So soak up the Muscovich spice.
Coming in hot.
All right. And those dulcet tones are from a man who but moments ago slipped surreptitiously out of a dinner celebrating his organisation's 150th anniversary, foregoing a night of revelry in favour of some report-related repartee. Tenant Reid. G'day, Tenant.
It is good to be with you, even with a star-studded night featuring the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and award-winning flute playing. I think not by either of those other two figures.
Lizzo?
Look, I can neither confirm nor deny the identities of the persons involved. But it is terrific, but I have multiple duties.
I'm glad you've got your priorities straight, Reid. On this week's show, we dig into the latest cost data for electricity generation and storage from CSIRO and AEMO. But first, threats of industrial action on 3 massive Western Australian LNG projects has sent shockwaves through global gas markets, causing us to reconvene. Energy crisis corner. Frankie, what is going on and how worried should we be?
Yeah, so there's a prospect of industrial action at Woodside and Chevron's gas plants off WA. And together those plants are, I think, responsible for something in the order of, 43 billion in LNG a year. And that sent European gas prices rocketing up something like almost 40% a few days ago over potential fears to supply because, collectively those platforms off of WA are responsible for about 11% of global LNG exports. So it's
just remarkable, really, isn't
pretty
it?
significant. So it sent some shudders in European markets, which, as we know, are more exposed and looking for alternatives to where they've, originally been sourcing their gas, having diversified away from Russian gas. So obviously there's rumours of how that industrial action might play out, but it's also we should also kind of reflect on the fact that the plants sort of supplying gas are also responsible for supplying about almost half of the gas used in WA as well for the state's mining sector, which is largely powered by gas, and also, burning gas for power that's sold in the southwest of the state. So it's not just foreign markets that would have cause to worry about in interruption to exports, it's also the great state of WA that relies on that gas. So the WA Energy Minister is being pretty tight-lipped at the moment and just saying that if there was action that they would respond in an appropriate manner. But needless to say, everyone is watching what's going on.
And while we're all watching it, I think there are two thoughts out of this that are particularly at the top of my mind. One is that 40% rise for a couple of days in the European market was a 40% rise off a base that is so dramatically lower than this time last year that if you look at a full chart of the prices, you can barely see the rise in the last few days. So this event is important. It's being closely watched. It's causing turmoil, but also global gas markets and Europe's energy situation are a lot better than they were. So this of itself, I think, is not going to push us all the way into the very cornermost corner of Energy Crisis Corner on its own. The second thought is that the previous go-around of Energy Crisis Corner was about European overdependence on Russia. And in the LNG market, despite, there's been a lot of talk in minerals about Australia benefiting from the perception of over-concentration of markets in their dependence on processing of stuff in Russia or the production of equipment in China, or the production of equipment in China. When it comes to LNG, we are the question mark over-dependence locus. We've been very successful in LNG in the past 15 years or so. And so maybe we're a source of highly correlated risk across multiple assets that are all subject to, a couple of unions and other things that they share in common. So while we might have some things to gain from nerves about supply chain fragility, we've got some things to worry about as others try and reduce their dependence on us.
And we're increasingly seeing that in diplomatic efforts from foreign governments who are prevailing upon us, the Australian government, to make sure that the supply chain isn't interrupted and they don't suffer the downstream impacts of that, which is a really interesting development. For mine, this just underlines the underlying fragility in gas market in particular, but also just the psychology of those markets and those market participants. People are on on tenterhooks to some degree. While prices are lower, the last European winter went better than many had expected. Folk are also conscious that the effort to get through winter was assisted by a relatively mild winter last year, and we wait to see how this coming winter proceeds, but there's no guarantees on that front.
No, but I think the other moderating factor that they're also talking about is that their storage levels are very high at the moment as well. So they've, I think in the space of that last couple of years have really well and truly acted to shore up the reserves that they could, possibly accumulate ahead of time. And, but, as you say, the nature of this European winter isn't known yet, even though we are very much heading into an El Nino cycle. And if you read any of the broader climate reporting, you'd be expecting that 2023 is going to be the hottest year on record by the time we're done. So, look, who knows what that means for this European winter. I guess they're about as prepared as they could possibly be.
Yeah. And demand in Europe for natural gas is well down on where it was 1 or 2 years ago. So they're doing a lot of things. We'll see how they go. The weather, you're right, who knows what it's going to be. The climate trend is pretty obvious, but how that plays out, both in terms of the specific weather for next winter, but just how it plays out with energy systems, like we'll have to see. Europe had a hot winter and drought last year, which reduced output, among other things, from nuclear power plants, which couldn't access the level of cooling that they needed, both from water constraints and the license to use what water there was flowing for cooling. And so, to some extent, warmer weather, even though it meant less gas demand in some respects, meant more gas and coal demand in power. So who the heck knows? It is fragile, but it's not quite as fragile a European energy system as it was before the war in Ukraine.
All right. Shall we chat about a report?
I'm eager.
Well, you literally left a fancy dinner to chat about this report, Tennant, so I hope it's worth it.
Me too, Luke.
Every year, CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, and AEMO, our energy market operator, release a report called GenCost, which aims to provide a standard benchmark for current and projected costs of electricity generation and storage technologies. GenCost is important as it helps identify trends in the current capital costs of electricity infrastructure in close to real time, and its cost projections for generation technologies are the subject of intense interest among energy wonks, as these projected costs are a crucial input into the modelling exercises that underpin energy system planning. So GenCost 2022-23 landed last month, Tennant. You were keen to talk about it. What did you make of it?
So GenCost is both, a product that's been iterated a bunch of times itself, and it's also the latest in a long line of similar exercises in Australia. The Australian energy generation technology reports and various iterations of those, which have been both an input into policy and planning and grist for the mill of people who want to argue that some technologies are bad and some technologies are good, or complain about the processes for years and years and years and years and years. This is sagas built on sagas, stretching back into the dim mists of time. And so I thought that this iteration was both interesting in its own right. What's been the big stories in the evolution of energy technology costs in the last 12 months, but also how far have we advanced in the process both of producing this information and then the discourse around that information. Are we in good shape? Are we becoming ever more sophisticated and wise? Or are we thrashing around in a well of nonsense and muck because nobody remembers how unproductive similar arguments were years ago? And I don't know, I think it might be a bit of the latter, sadly.
So I'm not sure what the barometer is for success when it comes to the discourse around GenCost, because I will sort of declare myself at this point as not really having weighed into the saga, past, present, and yes.
Clean skin.
So when you guys sent me all these links to Twitter threads and stuff like that around this year's Drama Fest, I just didn't quite get it, because I read the introduction to the report and the framing of it, and I couldn't understand where some of the critiques were coming from necessarily, if they'd also read the various disclaimers and, this is what this report is used for and telling you versus not telling you. So anyway, I just feel like people want to have a go. They're going to have a go, aren't they?
Well, you have to have a go to get a go. But let's see, honest broker Frankie Muscovich, where you are on this by the end of this discussion. Maybe you will have been radicalised into anger at the GenCost industrial complex, or maybe you will have been pacified into complacency.
Well, I look forward to that assessment from Muscovich on her way out the door. But it's interesting to read through this. I must admit that most of my interactions with GenCost over the years have been scanning through for the tables and just eyeballing eyeballing the numbers on the way through.
A shocking admission, and yet that's what a lot of people do with this report.
Well, but it's actually been good. This is one of the virtues of the pod, being forced to sit down and spend an afternoon reading the thing. And it reads like an extended pre-buttal of all the arguments that the authors know are coming.
They've been round the block.
About why the decisions they've made about how to model these things are rubbish.
Yeah.
So it doesn't come across as defensive, I don't think, but it understands where it exists in the ecosystem. It understands that there's going to be arguments, and it does its best to anticipate them and set out the reasoning why it's arrived at the place that it has, right?
We should set out a little bit more of like what it does and why it does it, I think. So, like, I would say GenCost does three things. It gathers or commissions a consultant to go off and gather the latest capital cost data and some other technical performance parameters that are important to the cost of operating new electricity generation and storage infrastructure. And, like, what is that information verifiably from stuff that's been built lately, not contracts that have been signed lately or promises or brochures, but what's been built, what were its costs when it was built.
And I think that the time-bound nature of this is also what makes it really useful, right?
Yep.
Like the figures that would feed into this 2022, 2023 report are things, are costs taken from projects that are basically being finalised this year, so that they were current.
Yeah.
I think, this was being drafted mid-2022. So that's when those prices would have been current. We're not talking about quotes for future projects that have, in the early processes of being commissioned or started. It's stuff that's being completed right now.
Yep. And then they take that capital cost data and they project how that those capital costs may evolve over time based on some scenarios for what happens globally around the pace of broadly the pace of climate ambition and emissions reduction and deployment of technologies around the world, and also some thoughts and data on learning rates and on how other things might evolve, like land costs. And then finally, but probably least importantly, they take those things and they calculate some levelised cost of electricity numbers for 2030 and 2040 and 2050 for most of the technologies they look at under the three broad global scenarios of current policies, if only current policies worldwide are implemented and nothing new ever, policy sufficient to achieve net zero before 2050 globally, and policy sufficient to achieve it after 2050 globally. And they do all that so that other people who are doing more sophisticated modelling of energy systems, not like one project or one generic technology, can have a common basis of numbers to draw on for capital costs for the exercises that they do. And that's it, really. That's the legitimate use of this work. But then there's what a lot of people do, which is just to flip to the back.
Well, and I'm deducing from the Twitterati drama that's been going on around this that a lot of the arguments kind of in and around this are from where people pick up the levelised cost of electricity estimates and use that to make whatever argument I guess they're seeking to make. But as a clean skim, looking at this report, I found it the least interesting part of the document and almost reads like a little bit of an afterthought, especially when, they're pretty clear about the sort of shortcomings of using levelised cost of electricity for much of anything.
So shall we dispense with the levelised cost of electricity bit of this, because we're diving into it. So the thing that is striking, having had you, Tennant, sort of say we need to do the GenCost report, there's all kinds of arguments happening on Twitter, and you get to the levelised cost of electricity, and that section specifically is, there's a good page of the good people at CSIRO and AEMO explaining why the levelised cost of electricity is a bit rubbish. And nobody should be paying very much attention to it.
Yes.
And it actually goes through a number of its key shortcomings and explains, the things that they've done over the years to try and ameliorate them to the degree that's possible, but, that's only possible to a certain extent. So take it all with a massive handful of salt, everybody, which everybody seems to have skipped over. At least on Twitter.
Yes.
And continued arguing about exactly the same things they've been arguing about for a very long time.
So, is it worth kind of also just being really clear about the limitations they state around this? One, obviously, do we have a shorthand for levelised cost of electricity? That's such a mouthful to say over and over again.
LCOE.
LCOE? Is that our...
Nobody says LCOE.
What do people say? ELCO?
Nobody says that. Lamenzl?
Lamenzl.
LCOE. It's clunky, but it's shorter.
LCOE. So it doesn't, that doesn't take account of any additional costs associated with individual technologies, and they call out specifically, integration costs of variable renewables. And that seems to be where some of the latest gripes are being kind of aired. But it also doesn't take account of the risks associated with fossil fuel technologies from potentially being subject to more stringent climate change policies and, costs that would be imposed on fossil fuels looking to be phased out. And equally, it also doesn't acknowledge that you have different types of generation technologies in the system for different reasons. They're not all there to do the same thing. You have some tech like gas peakers and things like that are used less frequently, which means they have a higher cost, but they're obviously, their value is being able to, be available at peak times and things like that. So in that sense, it's not easy to do apples to apples comparisons with these things. So I don't know, I just sort of felt like that was all pretty sensibly laid out.
And they've tried over the years to remedy a number of those things in rough and ready ways. So they're trying to address the higher risk profile, or to say the least, there's all kinds of ways that you could deal with the carbon issue for fossil generators in this kind of analysis. And they followed the tradition started with modelling for the Finkel review of just forcing in a 5% risk premium on the finance for those sorts of generators, which is pretty crude but it's also something more sophisticated would probably not be any more right. So they've tried some things over the years in response to successive waves of criticism of LCOE as very crude. And I think they're arriving back at, well, look, we can keep adding more bells and whistles. But fundamentally, levelised cost of energy, all the costs of a generator over its lifetime spread across all the energy that it will produce over its lifetime, and all those costs and future generation discounted back to the present is just never going to be more than a broadly indicative tool. And if you're actually concerned about making real decisions, about the energy system or about, do I build this project? You need a lot more, like a lot more than a table at the back of this report.
All right. Can I put this in terms that our sports adult nation might actually understand? The energy transition is not the Women's World Cup. The LCOE is not a scoreboard. Renewables aren't defeating nuclear 7-6 on penalties. It's just not how it works. And having arguments on Twitter about which is cheaper based on the levelised cost of electricity is completely unproductive, because you've got to build a system that works together. And some of the more interesting analysis that comes out of this exercise, which goes to the system integration cost, is actually kind of interesting, about the basket of technologies one would need at 60% renewables versus 70% renewables. As you're adding that incremental additional renewable capacity, how much of that is storage in an optimal situation? How much of that is peaking generation that can support those renewables in a different way? It is just completely unhelpful in that sense to think of technologies as winning or losing. They are all only useful in context, right?
Yes. A generator, a project, is not an energy system. And in a system, you need like a lot of different resources playing different roles in different places with different characteristics. It's not all going to be the same.
Okay. Have we dispensed with the controversy? Can we get back to the report? Or
I don't know if we have completely, but I think we should get back to the report for now.
Yes. Okay, so if we're circling back to what, to my clean skin eyes, appear new insights for this year's report, is that they've had a go at modelling, I guess, the costs of inflation, right? Like they're trying to represent what's been happening in the world over the last couple of years by reflecting the fact that, stuff has gotten more expensive pretty much across the board, right?
Yeah.
So I think almost every technology increased in costs, and they seem to trace that back to around the 2020 mark, when they noticed, given a lot of these technologies are declining in cost over time, particularly renewables and less mature technology that's, that are on learning curves, that the decline in cost had started to slow down. So they'd sort of tracked it back to that. And then basically through this year, so the 2022 to 3 period, sort of around a 20% across the board increase in prices, although experienced differently across different technologies. I think solar fared a bit better. I think that was only up by about 9-10%. Wind was higher at 35%, and most of this, like across the board, traces back to supply chain impacts, so like material costs going up, but also freight costs, so where the things are coming from across the world. So I think that was, an interesting set of insights. And then also they've talked about how they're choosing to model that impact over the next few years as well. They've basically, to my understanding, assumed that we're peaking at inflation sort of right now, and then a lot of these kind of technologies going to, resume their sort of declining cost trajectory over the next few years, and around 2027 or so. And
this is a perfect segue from the critical minerals report we did last episode, right? Because it's all about the way that particularly those material costs are flowing through to clean energy technologies. And they get into at a fairly high level, but, what the impact of demand is going to be on the trajectory for those inflationary impacts ameliorating. So, they've effectively got a couple of scenarios. One is that things like, continue as they are in terms of ambition, and they say the inflationary impacts are going to subside in around 2027. And in response to feedback from, folk that say, well, no, ambition's going to ramp up, and those supply constraints, particularly on materials, are going to continue because of that increased ambition. It might take until 2030. So there's those two scenarios that they're playing with, but it goes to that point we were discussing, right? Like, if we do what many listeners to this podcast would hope, and countries continue to ramp up their ambition, that does have flow-on effects for those impact costs.
And it highlights the distinction between the different pieces of this exercise, because the observed inflationary impacts so far, so 20% up capital cost on average across a whole basket of technologies, like that has been observed. And then everything else is informed speculation or self-consistent extrapolation of premises on how that might change over time. But, I think we're going to need a bit more observation before we're super confident.
Tennant, how did you feel about their assumption that inflationary impacts on these inputs have peaked?
So I think that's actually very plausible, at least for some of this. In the solar part of things, like module prices globally are back to their prior trend. Like it's improving greatly. Silicon prices seem to be fine. Wind, on the other hand, is going through a rough patch a further rough patch with some major suppliers saying they're going to be, or people doing projects are going to be losing money if they committed to projects based on a fixed price contract, and now they're facing inflated costs to deliver. There's some other problems with reliability of components from a major supplier. So I don't know how quickly things are going to shake out for wind, but I'm very ready to believe that the solar side of it will actually shake out much faster even than is assumed here. But you've got to more or less take a guess and just show your priors, show your work, and then everyone needs to acknowledge that there's a bit of uncertainty there.
Yeah, well, and also because this isn't just an energy story, right? Like, I work in the building sector, and the costs of steel and timber and so many construction materials also used in energy generation and transmission equipment have been very high over the last couple of years. And so, I think you can also observe the impact in other sectors and how that's potentially coming off or ameliorating. So with some of these technologies where some of the price impacts have been driven by, potentially just traditional material costs like steel and things like that. There is some suggestion based on the experience in other sectors as well that, costs aren't continuing to increase. Like they've sort of reached that that point of not increasing further, but they've not started to come down yet either. So, I think that's sort of the interdependency or the competition for those materials in other sectors is also relevant here as well.
And some people have given AEMO and CSIRO feedback at points in the ISP process and the GenCost process that they're very down on costs. They think this is the new normal and things aren't going to be getting cheaper from here. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that point of view. A lot of prices for commodities, for materials, they do bounce around. They don't tend to just hit a peak and stay there forever. Wages are sticky, but commodity prices not so much. And it's, with all the cost reductions induced by learning in the value-added components and the technology components of some of these technologies, as I think you've observed in the past, Luke, the raw materials element of the pricing, it becomes ever more significant the more cost is stripped out of everything else. So, a bit of cyclicality will show up all the more so but cycles go both ways.
It's true, but that sort of leads into another conversation, which is their treatment of learning rates, which has been a subject of some interest on this podcast, because they acknowledge learning rates are a thing, but they are perhaps not as optimistic about the opportunity for learning rates to continue. After a certain period, they sort of assume a flatlining of learning rates, which I found interesting and perhaps a little bit more pessimistic than some of the other papers that we've read on the pod would suggest is appropriate.
Yeah. If you go back to that Oxford paper, which we have said so much about, one of the differences appears to be that in the Oxford paper they say don't do this move where you set limits or a reduction over time in the learning rates for particular technologies. You get more realistic results if you just let the exponential increase in the amount of deployment needed to drive the learning produce a slowing in the actual outcome over time, rather than trying to turn down the learning rate itself. That is, as you saturate the market for deploying stuff and you need to deploy ever more stuff to get your 10%, 20%, depending on the technology learning rate, like that will slow it down. In this exercise, CSIRO have got an early learning rate and a later learning rate for most of these technologies. And that's an effort to be more realistic. The view out of the Oxford paper by Rupert Way et al., the insight from them was that actually a seemingly less realistic, unconstrained learning rate produces results more like what we've seen in reality.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because if you look at their treatment of the learning rates associated with large-scale solar PV, they acknowledge how difficult it is.
Yeah.
to predict how low solar can go, and they sort of be scratching their goatees and going, well, the historical learning rate for solar PV has not slowed, so it's very difficult to predict the final minimum cost. So they're just sort of looking at those costs, spiraling down, and as has been a shortcoming that has been observed on many previous modelling exercises. It's just assumed at some point they need to level out, without necessarily, as far as I can see, a huge amount of logic for why that's the case, as opposed to kind of the observed trajectory to date.
Yeah.
I wish to register an objection. At this time, to the best of my knowledge, Paul Graham, Jenny Hayward, James Foster and Lisa Hayes do not possess goatees.
Furrowing their brows, I think we can say, in a much more appropriate gender-neutral way.
Our apologies, good authors.
I think this shocking effort to pull the wool over the public's eyes is a day of infamy.
Yes. I apologise to all involved.
Maybe we can offer up some suggestions on learning rate figures as an olive branch.
Well, I think the substantive work will continue, and they will continue to seek refinements to it. And maybe one of the refinements for GenCost 23-24 should be having a go at the model approach in the Oxford paper, and stick that in their spreadsheet pipe and smoke it.
So they're smoking pipes now.
It doesn't sound as conciliatory as I intended.
That doesn't sound remotely conciliatory. Tenor withdraws that.
All right. How are we going? What else do we have to say?
Specific technology observations might be fun.
Yes.
If requiring caution.
Sure.
Who's got a favourite technology?
Oh, okay. The one that massively jumped out at me was the global scenario. So I think we talked about the fact that they mapped 3 different scenarios over that sort of 2030 to 2050 time horizon. The least ambitious one is sort of modelled on current policies, so just things that have been announced now, and I think they also try to line them up with the equivalent IEA scenarios as well. So the current policy one, you've got one that's net zero by 2050, and then there's a net zero sometime after 2050 as well. And looking at the global scenarios for offshore wind, it kind of goes from not much of a share under current policy settings, and certainly from where we are now, to a stonkingly high proportion of global generation, something in the order of 22%, I think, by 2050, which is enormous. And so so if you look at the growth of different technologies as part of that sort of overall pie, that sort of comes out of nowhere from sort of where we are now to that global scenario where we need to be at net zero by 2050. So super interesting in that respect. But then equally, is that as relevant for Australia? Potentially not, because we've got, access to already very low cost, large scale solar and onshore wind opportunities that are already lower in price. So I think just looking at that dynamic, the potential for offshore wind globally versus domestically would be super interesting to track over time.
Yeah. What about you, Luke? Have you got a favourite?
Look, I was interested in the conversation around battery storage. It kind of takes a big Sharpie and underlines the points that we were making in the last episode around how impacted battery costs have been by some of those critical minerals inputs. But it sort of also goes to and acknowledges this uncertainty about just how low batteries can go in terms of costs. Like, are they on a PV-like trajectory? Are they going to level out at some point? And I think this is one of the great uncertainties facing folk that are trying to get their head around what a least cost transition looks like as far as the energy system goes, because batteries critical role to play, but they are one technology among many, as we acknowledged earlier in the episode, and how big a role they play in an optimised scenario depends a lot on how cheap they can get. So this is one of the projections that sort of sees a levelling out. Costs continue to go down after 2030, 2035, but level out significantly despite, projecting significant cost declines between now and 2030. Not entirely sure if there's a good reason why that's the case. Differs a bit depending on scenarios, as Frankie was saying, but I just wonder if batteries could actually be more like PV and less likely to just bottom out in terms of benefiting from those learning rates as deployment goes up.
And there's a huge amount of innovation going on, competing battery chemistries, improving performance. There's just lots of stuff happening in batteries, which both makes it an exciting space and one where, who knows? One of the implications they took around the battery front for their rough guide to how system integration may go. So, that they're not really doing the kind of system modelling that the integrated system plan process is doing. But they suggest that based on the way costs have evolved recently and the way that their future cost projections go, that there's a little more role for batteries in balancing renewables and a little less role for transmission in balancing renewables, although both are still quite large parts of the future they sketch. And those relativities are pretty interesting. There's a lot of people who dislike particular transmission projects who want to say we can do it all with batteries, which I don't think this report is really grist for, but certainly the fact that there is at the margin a trade-off between those tools is true.
And to underline the point, it's the benefit the transmission lines gives you in terms of diversity of generation location, particularly as it relates to wind, which is helpful, right? So that diversity means that the wind's blowing somewhere, and you can transmit those electrons around the system on that basis, versus using storage to shift energy from one time of the day to the other. And so it was interesting, the framing, that in a sense they are competing technologies for that task of ensuring the energy is available when we need it and where we need it.
Now, I'm not going to pick a favourite technology because after forcing us to pick favourites, Tennant, you're going to stay above the fray. I'm the true honest broker here.
I have more favourites if you need.
Oh.
Yeah, go on, come in on your high and mighty horse.
My high horse.
Yeah.
Well, so what I'm going to say, though, is that there's a real distinction in not just this report, but every similar report between technologies that have been built either here or anywhere lately and ones that haven't.
Yep.
And the latter, we need to take cost estimates with a grain of salt. We need to take brochures from would-be sellers of these things with a grain of salt and say, well, how many small modular reactors have you built last year? But also we need to take the estimates in this report for things that haven't been built really, and the authors are doing their best. The engineering consultancy Oricon are doing their best. But, until you try it, you're not really going to know. And that's been a weakness of many, 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 many reports. And 15 years ago, these kind of reports were saying, wind and solar in Australia, geez, those things will be very expensive. And people who like those technologies were accusing, Martin Ferguson, of cooking the books to make them look bad. And look, then and now, I don't think anybody's actually cooking the books. It's just hard to come up with numbers for things that haven't been built yet that are going to turn out to be robust when they come into contact with reality.
And also they do sort of state in this report where technologies aren't mature in Australia, but, they might be deployed elsewhere, that you would also need to take those, as you're saying, you need to take those figures with a grain of salt because, the scale that can be achieved, say, within China on certain technologies have very different kind of implications for the kind of labour costs involved and, other kind of significant inputs that would impact on the overall cost of, that technology being rolled out in an Australian context. So where the information, exists from other places, they do present that as needing to be taken with a grain of salt, but it's also just very tempting to look at those costs regardless. The nuclear SMR sort of fall into that category as well. Or will they basically just say that there isn't actual data on builds yet, or at least in this year, so they're only projecting that from, 2030 onwards or something.
Yeah.
Which it makes the debate quite challenging if you're engaging with it in good faith. It's an asymmetrical argument, right? You have a basket of technologies which we have data for and that we can point to and we understand, have a certain sets of costs associated with them. You have another basket of technologies which it's kind of speculative where exactly they're going to land. And, how I resolve that in my head at least is doubling down on the things that we know work now while continuing to do what we can to deploy the things that have some prospect and, watching their progress closely is kind of the best we can do.
I'm going to make a controversial editorial comment. I don't usually court controversy, and maybe I won't succeed this time. But on the nuclear question, because that's where a lot of the heat in the fights about GenCost comes from. Nuclear curious people feel that their bright new technology has been done dirty. People who are nuclear skeptical point at this and say, look, it's very expensive. It's the most expensive form of electricity or something like that, although there are some more expensive ones in there. And we've got a political debate at the moment between at the federal level, one side that's saying this is a waste of time, nuclear, and it's illegal and we're going to keep it illegal and let's just get on with real things. And the other side is saying nuclear, it's dumb that it's illegal. We should legalize it. They're not really saying anything else. And Luke, you made a sports metaphor. I'm going to try and even more ill-informed gambling metaphor. Nuclear energy is a bit like Tats Lotto. Cheap, widely deployable, solves all the problems, modular, and we get all the cost reductions or whatever, is a bit like winning Tats Lotto. It's probably not going to happen based on track record and the evidence to date. It'd be a bit weird and stupid to say, I'm so confident that you won't win Tats Lotto that I'm going to ban you from entering Tats Lotto. It would also be a bit weird and stupid to say my plan for my future life is I'm going to win Tats Lotto. You should be open to the possibility that you might win Tats Lotto. You should probably plan on the basis that you've got to go out and earn your living.
Yes. I think you're saying something similar to what I was saying in a more articulate and colourful way, which is we've got a basket of technologies which we're confident we can pull together into a credible energy system that will see us through the 21st century. And we've got some long shots, right? And the long shots, if they come off, that'd be great. I'm absolutely not adverse to exploring some of those, noting that we need to marshal our resources and not spend all our time messing around with things that delay. And so that's the trick, right? The idea that we would delay deploying technology we have now in favour of, hoping that something turns up down the track. That's what I get concerned about.
And I know, that's the concern, that you would look at some of the public arguments being made along this. But anyone who's got an interest in getting to the right outcome, we should be open to a couple of those long shots paying off. 20 or 30 years ago, technologies like solar and wind might have been viewed in that vein, right?
Yes. And I also think that we need to not be myopic in Australia. We talk a lot about how blessed we are in terms of resources, renewable energy resources, wind and solar. Incredibly cost competitive, lots of space to deploy them. There is a flip side to that, which we don't think about enough, which is other parts of the world are not necessarily so blessed. And so they are likely to require a different mix of technologies and technologies that might not make sense here. They could make sense overseas. And you know what else might happen? If they make sense enough overseas, they might get cheap enough that they eventually make sense here too later on.
Sure.
Right? So, we've got to be conscious of the particulars of our own situation relative to some of our friends overseas.
Absolutely.
GenCost. Frankie, have you been radicalised? On the way to the maternity ward. Down with GenCost T-shirt emblazoned across your chest.
How to be definitive on this? I can clearly say I was more likely to go into early labour watching the Matildas win the other night and the stress of that particular moment than reading this report. Like my family members were very concerned watching that game versus reading this report. I don't think I've been radicalised. think has a failed controversy. Even you, Tennant, going on the nuclear one. Far too sensible.
Ultra's interests to the last. As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
Well, I'm going to be naughty again and say two things. The very quick thing is, last time I said, hey, there's this room temperature superconductor material, LK99, that's probably not true. And indeed, it's not true.
Bow, bow.
It's not a room temperature superconductor. It's got some interesting magnetic properties, but won't be bringing like cheap maglev trains to you anytime soon. But the quest continues. The other thing I'll mention is I recently attended an open day at the Loy Yang A power plant and Loy Yang coal mine in Victoria, where AGL, the owner and operator, were inviting the business community, the community, everybody to get involved in visioning the energy hub that is going to follow the closure of coal power generation at that site. And there's a lot of ideas coming out of the woodwork, solar cell recycling and maybe remanufacturing, the operation of a big battery, the development of an industrial ecosystem, possibly around hydrogen, maybe blue hydrogen. There's a lot of ideas, and some of them AGL will be investing in, some of them it'll just be hosting. There's 12 years to go, but it's actually not a lot of time to build an industrial ecosystem. So that zone and the hopes of the immediate and broader community for a just transition and a busy future for that region in energy and in industry, it was a very interesting day, and I got to zeet some photos from a tour of the facility, which for any aficionados of great big infrastructure, there was some great snaps to be taken there. That was my amazing journey.
Did you go to the control room? Did they let you anywhere near it?
They did not, and they were right to do so.
Yeah.
They put us in a bus, and they sent the bus around the perimeter and around the mine. The mine is very big. It's really very big. That's my sage observation.
I'm very surprised that you've been working in this space for as long as you have, Tennant, and you haven't made it out there before.
Look, spreadsheets are a harsh mistress.
Okay. Well, for my one more thing, I've been reflecting on all the bad news that we've been enduring on the climate front, the extreme heat, the wildfires, and that have been experienced in places like Hawaii, low Antarctic sea ice. It goes on and on. And while it's shocking on one level, it's entirely unsurprising for those of us that have been sort of working in this space for a while. So there's that. I just think it's worth on this podcast acknowledging all of that is happening out in the world. But it's got me thinking about a couple of things. So for those of us that are working in this space, how we sustain ourselves and stop ourselves from burning out or getting overwhelmed or, getting disheartened as some of the things we've been concerned about for a long time start to come to pass. And also just how we avoid the general population, recognising how bad it is and then spiralling into apathy because the world seems to be spinning out of control. So on both of those fronts, mental health is really important, and there's a little organisation that I've been aware of for some time on the periphery of my network called Psychology for a Safe Climate, which is working to help build people's capacity to respond constructively to climate change and process the feelings that they're having about it, but then, band together to do something about it. And I just think that's a really productive space, and it's a testament to folk that have been involved in that organisation, which has been around for 13 years. It's something that is probably it's going to need more effort and investment and attention over years to come, I suspect, because things can get bad, but that's not a moment to give up. That's a moment to redouble our efforts, but we've got to take care of ourselves as we move through the challenges ahead of us, right? So that's my one more thing.
It's a pretty good one.
It's a great one. Thoroughly second that. I've certainly made use of some of those resources at times. And, thinking about bringing another tiny human into the world is also a good pause for reflection on why we do what we do and what we want to be, handing on to the next generations. One of the other things that helps me get out of bed and keep doing the work that we do is sharing space with you two lovely humans. So my one more thing is a little bit of a tribute to, both of you, but also wearing my little global vice president for marketing and extortion hat on the way out, just for a little bit, is to reflect on, the time that we've shared together over the last year, building up a little community, and I think some of our exciting plans to evolve this lovely podcast over the next little while. And to that end, Summer Uppers, we'd really like to hear a little bit about what you think of the podcast. So I know we often encourage you to tweet or now it's Zeet at us, or
I don't think it is.
It might not be Zeet.
It might not be
I think
Zeet.
they want to say post, but that's a bloodless term.
Tenant's trying to make Zeet a thing, but I don't know if it's taking off.
It's so fetch.
It's so fetch. We always ask you to send us your thoughts, on papers and other things, but we're also really interested in making sure this podcast is meeting all of your needs and desires. So we'd love to get some thoughts from you. We've put together a very brief survey for anyone sort of inclined to tell us what you think, things you like about the pod, things you think we could be doing better, because we have plans, exciting plans, and we'd really like to hear from all of you, your suggestions, because you're a big part of the reason we do this as well. And that will give me plenty of fodder with which to go and scheme whilst I'm not working away my day job for the next few months. Like, the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, because you're going to be looking for things to do, Frankie, over the next...
Totally, I'll have all this spare time. Yeah.
Slow afternoons.
That's right. Well, I can be optimistic.
Siestas to dream.
That's right. All this unlimited sleep. Just don't know what I'll do with myself.
And I think we should say to our listeners, this is not an onerous survey. This is like 5 questions. 2 of them are multiple choice. This won't take a huge amount of time, and we really value your feedback.
Yeah.
There shall be a link to it in the show notes.
Aha!
All right. Well, that's your last one more thing for a little while, Frankie. All the best for the next few weeks.
With a rather more challenging one more thing.
New recurring segment, one more baby.
Very intermittent.
I've been guaranteed it's just one more thing, like there's not 2 of them or anything.
Well, we'll be thinking of you. But in the meantime,
Yes.
as we mentioned last episode, the fabulous Alison Reeve, Deputy Director of Energy and Climate at the Grattan Institute, will be filling in for Frankie, so never fear. Tennant and I will be kept in line, and we'll be with you every fortnight until Frankie's return at some indeterminate future date.
I love it. I can't wait to listen along with everyone else. And I'll be lobbing. I've already got suggestions for you guys. I've even started putting papers in the list. I'm like,
And where should you send those suggestions, Frankie?
no, I mean, I'm wanting to hog this for the next little while. Like, I should get preference for for putting my suggestions up. Like, come on, guys.
You can't get preference unless you go through proper channels.
Yes, I can.
Oh, shots fired.
Frankie,
Shots fired.
he's not trying to push you onto the email. He's trying to get you to tell our listeners they can send their paper.
I know that, but I wasn't fighting.
All right.
Foiled.
Tenet. If someone other than Frankie wanted to submit a paper for you, Alice, and I to read.
You don't have to worry about it, guys, for a little while.
Where would they send papers?
They should send those papers with a very high chance of acceptance to mailbag at letmesumup.net.
Yes. And Frankie,
Yes.
for those listeners that are pining for your dulcet tones over the next little while, where should they go to examine our back catalogue?
Oh, well, if you want to hear the golden threads of our back catalogue woven together seamlessly, you can go to letmesumup.net. There's over 30 episodes on there now, which is very exciting. That's more than enough to, like, paint a whole house too, I would say. Like, you know, if painting, you know, is the chosen pastime.
A very specific scenario.
Well, I may have painted some walls and listened to our podcast in the past.
All right. Well, for Tenant Reed and for the last time for a little while, Frankie Muscovich, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.